Hello, welcome to Will Barnes Jewelry Studio. Today we're going to learn how to do castellated bezels. Something that I really like to do, and there's a lot of people that just don't know how to do it because of the skill and complexity to achieving the desired results. There's a lot of different jigs out there that people have been using, but there's really nothing like doing it from scratch. And that's what I'm going to show you how to make today. This is the beginner level castellated bezels. I make about 4 or 5 different types of castellated bezels. This is the beginning stage of getting to that level. Later on I'll be showing you guys how to make those as well, but you gotta start at step 1. So here we are, and let's do it. The first thing you're gonna want to do is have a stone. Obviously, this is some chrysoprase that I'm using, and you'll need some bezel wire, which in this case it's going to be a lot thicker than you would normally use for a regular smooth bezel. This is a 4mm by 1.63 millimeter stock. I think that translates to about 12 gauge. You could roll your own material if you wish, but I always like to use fresh milled material from Rio Grande, and just seems to work better because there are some issues with having to bend the prongs over when you're using material that isn't as pure as the material that you would get directly from the distributor. So I've basically just cut a rough amount, which I know will reach all the way around the stone. I'm going to file the end of this so it's nice and flat. I'm just going to put this at the end of my bench plate and use a flat file. Constantly looking at it to see if it's at a 90-degree angle, and also that it's nice and smooth. Should be good. Now I'm going to bend the bezel wire around the stone. This stuff's pretty thick, so I'll be using needle nose pliers. These are larger than usual. You can use smaller ones like this. Any way you look at it, you're going to have to muscle it because this material is kind of thick. You might want to start with something a little bit thinner. You'll thank me for that, especially when you get to the bezel setting process, because it's a little bit harder to bend over this thick material than it is thinner material, for obvious reasons. I usually just start off with I just eye it out and try to use, like, visual memory to get the right shape. So I'm just gonna bend it over and kind of hope for the best. And it's usually pretty good. So that angle's pretty good right there. The tip of it needs to come over just a tad, so I'll do that with these little tiny needle nose pliers, and that'll get me going in the right direction. You know, you could just muscle. I'm just gonna try to muscle this over and with my hands and see what happens. But you know, I might have to go over there and anneal this metal, and I think I will, because some of these bends are pretty tight. It's much easier to bend the metal when you anneal it. So let's do that. Just gonna set it on this ceramic block right here and heat it up a bit. I'm using a atmosphere acetylene torch. I just like using this for the amount of heat that I can achieve in a short period of time. I have a welding background, so I have a pretty good control over the heat situation, which you'll need to have if you're going to be using a torch that gets this hot. And that's that. I'm going to quench this in my quench bath, and let's get back to the bench. Now that we've annealed the silver, we can now shape the metal around the stone. And because it's been annealed pretty good, might be able to just bend it by hands, which some of you guys might be able to do. If not, you might want to use some pliers, because it is pretty thick. It also depends on the thickness of the metal that you'll be using. I happen to think that the thicker the metal, the cooler the castellation looks. So I'm getting to this last curve, and everything looks pretty good. Might need to come in just a tad right there. Maybe went a little too far. But it's fitting on there pretty well so far. And now that we're getting close to the point where I need to cut the metal, I'm going to get it as close as possible to overlapping. Sometimes you can just overlap it, but it kind of malforms the metal to a point where it's got a twist to it, which can create some adverse situations later on in the process. However, if it's close, as you can see, you should be able to just eye it out, is what I usually do. And this looks about right. It's better to be a little bit longer than shorter, because then it might not fit, the stone might not fit in there. I have a lapidary equipment, so I can usually just trim down the stone in that regard if that does happen. But a lot of you guys don't have that type of equipment, so you'll want to, you know, basically measure twice, cut once. Anyhow, let's take this to the saw or to the bench pin and cut it real quick. Okay, so now I've made a little line on the side of this metal. I tried to do it cut it as much at a 90-degree angle as possible. That way, when the two ends meet, there aren't any strange angles that are preventing you from doing it correctly. because I'm cutting a thick material, I'm using a number 6 blade, which is probably still overkill, but I don't like to have to replace my saw blades that often. So. But anyhow, now that we have it cut and it's close, what I can do is use my pliers and make that final bend, and hopefully it's, you know, exactly where we need it to be. For this last step of bending the bezel, I'm going to use these smaller needle nose pliers and just bend that end over, and looks pretty good to me. Let's see what it looks like on the stone. Pretty good. Might take you a few times to get that part right, because I mean, this is, if you don't bend it right, your metal can look kind of funky once you get to the finish line. So the more you do it, the better you'll get, and you know, it's just kind of like how life goes. Everything gets better with practice. So the next phase of the project will be to sand the back, is what I like to do, and I like to use a belt sander. So let's take it over to the belt sander. This probably isn't the safest way to do it. This is made for wood and other things, but I'm sure after using this a million times, I'm sure I'm not going to hurt myself or anything. But you might want to use something else, maybe just a piece of sandpaper, or you can just, you know, rub it like that. And you would just want to kind of make sure that the surface is flat most of all. But anyways, I'm going to use this. I have a quench bath over here because it is going to get hot. So I try to dip it in there every so often. That way it doesn't get too hot. Alright. Now that the bezel is nice and flat, we'll take it back over to the bench pin. Okay, now that we're back over here at the bench pin, what I like to do is I like to put a bevel on the inside edge of the bottom. I'm using this half round file to do so. It doesn't have to be a huge bevel, but this will help it withstand the pressure when you bend these prongs over, because if you just solder directly onto the base plate, you might run into some issues such as cracking and such with your prongs, just from the sheer force of bending it over the stone. Okay, now that I've put a bevel on the inside edge of the bottom where to be soldered to the back plate, I'll file this other bottom edge to make a bevel on that side. I'm just gonna put it against the bench pin and, you know, basically just file back and forth. And that'll also help withstand the additional pressure needed to set these prongs. Like I said, there's many ways to do castellation. I make about 5 different types of castellated bezels, which I'll show you later. But the first style is one of the styles, probably the second style that I started doing, which is probably the most common out there. And I think that's a good place to start when it comes to making castellated bezels, and that's why we're starting at this particular juncture. Anyhow, now what I'll do is find or use some sheet for a back plate. I like to use 18 gauge, which is, you know, kind of thick. You don't need it to be as thick as the bezel, but you don't want it so thin that your entire base plate bends when you try to bend the prongs over. So I'm just going to, you know, just cut a rough outline around the stone, just enough to be able to solder the bezel onto the base plate, and we'll go from there. Just going to saw this out real quick using a number 6 blade still. Here, so I'm just gonna take a right turn. Anyhow, that should be sufficient for our base plate. There we go. Yes, indeed it is. I like to use a wire brush to scratch up the surface where I'll be soldering it to, because that way the soldering gets good adhesion to the base plate, and that should be good enough. Now let's take it over to be soldered and be right back. Okay, now that we're over here at the soldering station, what I'm going to do is give it a nice coating of flux. I like to be a little bit liberal with it. Put some on the inside, put some on the outside. Oop. And I like to put some at the joints. Normally with the regular bezel you would just, you know, solder your joint and go from there and solder it to your base plate. But with castellated bezels, since you'll be making vertical cuts, your solder joint is always a good place to start. So the joint itself isn't that important because you will be cutting it out. I like to use the stick method when it comes to soldering. I generally have a longer piece of hard solder. I'm going to use hard solder. Anyhow, I'll just set that down right there. I have my little mini pliers so I don't burn my fingers. here we go. The torch turned on, exhaust. Start from the bottom, heating it up. I like to make sure all the moisture in the flux is dissolved before I put any kind of heat to the top section. That way it doesn't move around so much. After doing this a long time, you know, you'll know what color it needs to be when it gets to flux point. When you're using a thick back plate, you'll want to make sure that's nice and hot before you bring the heat to the top section. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to keep it at a distance. It's starting to want to move on me. And there you go. I'll dip this in my quench bath over here, and then I'll throw it in the pickle for a few minutes. Alright, now that we have our bezel soldered onto the back plate, we can now cut it out. Blade. Alright, there we go. We got that thing cut out. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this edge with a flat file just to remove my cut marks. That'll make it easier to clean up later on, because you want a nice polish. I'm using the coarse side of this file. There's two different grits to this particular file. I'm doing it with the heaviest grit first, and then I'll follow it with the finer grit. There's other ways you can do this. You can use an abrasive wheel on the flex shaft. You can use lapidary equipment, but I just want to show you guys how to do it the old-fashioned way first. That way you guys have a good idea of how you should be doing it, and then later on you can use other methods to speed up the process once you get used to doing them more often. Alright. Everything looks good. What you can't see right now is that this bottom edge has a nice little burr on it. So I'm just going to hit that with the file as well to remove that. You could also use belt sander or lapidary equipment to remove that burr as well. Or you can just do it by hand. And voila. Everything looks really good. You can see where this the joint is on here from the top. So what I like to do is hit that with the belt sander, and just to make it perfectly flat on the top surface as well. Let's do that. Alright, here we go. Here's the bezel. I'm just going to turn this baby on. Dip it in the quench bath. It's getting hot. Looks good. Alright, back to the bench. This top edge kind of has some scratches and stuff, and the inner edge of this bezel kind of has some burrs to it after using the belt sander. So what I'm going to do now is clean the inside of the bezel off so I can get the burrs off. And what I'm going to use is where is it? There we go. I'm going to use this sandpaper wheel. I don't know what they call it. It's Fordham makes them. Anyhow, I'm just going to use this to clean off the inside of this bezel of burrs. The burrs of the bezel. The burrs within the bezel. Whatever you just want to get those off. Probably a little bit too big for this bezel. I have other method. You could even use this to clean off some of those scratches from filing. There's a, 100 different ways to skin the cat, figuratively speaking. They sell these wheels in a lot of different grits, which will help in many ways. I use them for the inside of rings mostly. Anyhow, here we are. Now we have a bezel cut. This is how I like to make my castellated bezels. I see a lot of people laying these things flat and using chisels and all this other stuff and measuring equipment, but this is the way I like to do it. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to find the joints, the soldering joints, not any other kind of joint, and that's a good starting point for your first cut. You can usually see where it's at. There's usually like a tiny little seam. And that's where I like to start, because it's probably the most unattractive section of the bezels thus far. It doesn't have to be, but since it's being cut out, it really doesn't matter. And I as you can see, I have my bench pin on, so it's flat on the top, and then the angular portion of it is on the bottom. A lot of people have them the other way. I don't really see the difference. I've had them both ways. I like to have mine this way, so I can rest things on top. I use it as like kind of a little mini table sometimes when I'm making my bezels. And when it's at an angle, it's But anyhow, I start at that juncture where the two ends of the bezels meet, the soldering joint, and I cut about halfway through, starting at the top, and then I'll put my saw blade at an angle and basically make the cut go all the way to the bottom. I don't know if you can see that, but anyways, it's pretty much cut halfway through, half to about 3/4 of the way from the top to the bottom of the base plate on the inside, but on the outside it appears to have been cut all the way down from the top to the bottom. And that's just how I like to do it. And for the second cut, I like to go from right to left. So when I'm making my cuts, I can just keep turning it this way. If you're left-handed, you might want to turn it the opposite direction. But this is the way I like to do it. It can be a little bit dangerous. Not dangerous, but you might cut yourself. So you do want to be able to hold this thing down pretty good, because the blade sometimes wants to pull the bezel down, which brings it directly into your finger. I've cut myself probably hundreds of times over the years. But anyhow, to prevent that, you want to hold down pretty firmly. The second cut, I like create a little bit of like a square, basically, and that's about the width that I like to go. It's easier to judge by eye what a square looks like from the top. You also want to make sure that you're cutting perfectly vertically at a 90-degree angle from the base plate. That'll help you with your cuts, because if they're all at different angles, it's not going to look good, the final product. So I like to start with like a square on the top. That's what it looks like. And try to make your cuts perfectly vertical. And then like once you get about halfway through, I turn it downward like this, and then almost vertically. And if you can see that, you can see it's pretty much a square on the top, and those lines are pretty good and parallel. And you're just gonna keep doing that till you get to the end. Once you get to the end, things can get tricky. Yeah, you kind of have to plan ahead, but we'll get there when the time comes. So I'm just going to continue judging by eye the like a square, that kind of to make sure that these prongs are the same width. I'm using my fingernail as a guide, not as a guide, but just as a like a backstop. And I'm just putting the edge of the blade up against my fingernail, up on the side of the. If you're a female and you have long nails, this might be hard for you to do, or you might destroy your fingernail. Anyhow, what I like, I'm using it as a backstop, and that helps me gauge the width of the prong more effectively. And like I said, this is about a 12 gauge material that I'm using, which is kind of thick and might be harder to cut. So in terms of cutting it, even when it comes down to this portion, you might want to use thinner metal. And these number 6 blades are thicker than smaller blades as far as the width from the side, and that'll actually help prevent solder from soldering up these prongs when you get to the soldering process. So a wider gap, you know, you'll have better finished results when it comes to the soldering process. Ever so often I'll dip it into a lubricant to lubricate the blade. I use bar and chain oil for a chainsaw. I just used it one time and it worked good, so I just kept using it. And I basically just put like a sponge in the lid of a jar, and you know, dab it on there, and works good. It lasts a long time. One container of bar and chain oil will probably last you a few years, maybe more if you're not using it for a chainsaw. I do use it for a chainsaw, so I haven't. Sorry, as I was saying, the battery ran out of my camera, so I had to replace battery. But anyhow, like I was saying, I use bar and chain oil to lube up my blade, and it's worked for me pretty well, so I keep using it. Anyhow, let's move forward. I might edit that out anyways. Castellated bezels are pretty tedious. This is the probably least tedious of types of castellated bezels that you can make. It's a good starting point, and it's a precursor to the other types of castellated bezels, so it's definitely a good place to start. And then once you graduate from being able to do it this way, you can jump to the next step, which is a different type of castellated bezel. I'll show you those as well, but I can only do one video at a time. And once you cut your bezel nice and vertically, you could use it as a guide by just kind of looking at the angle of your saw blade when you're sawing. Just kind of try to match it up to the line next to it, make it parallel, and that'll help you get a nice consistent vertical aesthetic to your castellation. When you start doing them at weird angles and stuff like that, you can definitely see it in the long run. So the straighter your cuts, the better. When I first started making castellated bezels, I just had like a regular jewelry saw, which didn't cut very straight. And that definitely, made it difficult at first. Then I upgraded to this saw. I forgot what it's called. Anyhow, and that was good, but the frame is made out of aluminum and it bent on me, and then it wouldn't cut straight anymore. So then I moved on to this one, Green Lion saw frame, and this one's been really good for me. I cut this this little thing off the bottom and put a little notch so I could still tighten the blades and stuff. It just kind of got in the way for me, so I cut it off. I like to make my tools my own. That way they're more effective. Anyhow, we'll move forward. But anyways, a good saw is necessary if you're going to be doing this kind of work. I'll fast forward through some of these longer sections of the video. That way you don't have to watch me saw for an hour or whatever. My other video that I made, this is only my second video, wound up being like over 4 hours long. So I'm going to try to cut this one a little shorter, but still try to make it so you guys have all the information that you need. And like I was saying, here we are getting close to the end of where I started. So at this point, I probably should have cut this previous one maybe a little bit shorter, but you know, once you finish these up, most of the time you can't really tell if there's a thinner prong. So what I'm going to do right now, because I need to get 3 prongs within this area, I'm going to make 1 small one and 2 equal sized ones. So I'm going to make this one just a little bit smaller, or a bit smaller but not as wide, and then this final one right before the joint, I'm going to cut it right down the middle. So I have about 3 prongs that are just a little bit smaller, but if you look at it from the grand scale, the grand scheme of things, you can't really tell at all. So now let's take it to the next step, which will be to grind off. You could just leave it like this. Some people like to do their castellation like this and just leave it nice and square on the top. That's fine, but I like to put a nice bevel along this top edge, and that'll help me when it comes down to closing the prongs. It also makes the metal a little thinner, which makes it a little bit easier, and it'll hug the stone a little bit better. Okay guys, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to file this edge right here. I'm just going to use this half round file, the flat side of course. You could even use a flat file, whichever one you want to use. The half round is a little bit more rigid, so you can kind of get more controlled filings. Basically, I'm just creating a nice bezel or bevel and I'm trying to do like an equal distance from this inside wall to the outside wall. From the top you can see a little edge, you know, that edge from the top edge being minimized, but as long as you keep that consistent, it'll look nice and symmetric from the top. So I'm just going to keep doing that all the way around. As you can see, has a nice look to it around that edge. Just going to work my way all the way around. You could also do this on a lapidary wheel. I do that probably more often than I do it this way, but this is a good way to start. Like I said before, most people don't have lapidary equipment. If you do, use at your own risk, because these edges can be kind of sharp, and if you don't have the right kind of lapidary wheels, you might damage your wheels, which, you know, be kind of costly. I only know that because I've done it before. But, you know, you learn from your mistakes, and sometimes you can find loopholes in your process, and that'll save you time and effort. And when it comes to jewelry making, you want to increase your profits as much as possible while minimizing the amount of time you spend, which will give you more time to create more jewelry, which will also increase your profits, or the ability to make profits in your jewelry business. Takes a significant amount of hand strength to hold this thing down too, so
if your hands aren't super strong right now, this will definitely help you increase hand strength, which in my opinion will help you down the road with your jewelry making. There you have it, guys. There's a castellated bezel. Later on I'll show you guys how to solder these castellated bezels and how to do it effectively without filling these cuts with solder. I have a process that I like to use that'll help you achieve good results. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to click the subscribe button. On the next video I will be showing you how to set stones with castellated bezels, the different types of tools that we can use in order to achieve good results, and also tools that you can make to set your stones effectively on a castellated bezel. Thank you. See you next time.